Buckingham Palace finally ready for a reckoning over the births of Meghan Markle's two children, Archie and Lily?
So she had to accept, that the things would be happening on a national level. And that's what the royal family has to accept as well. And most of them understand that. And so you make announcements. You tell people, the child's going to be born. You tell it where it's going to be born. You tell it when it was born. You show the child at a certain point. You tell us who the godparents are going to be. And we all enjoy this. And we're very much then, we, the general public, very much on the side of the person doing that and sort of enjoying it because they are a family at the centre of the nation. And that's all part of it. So to deny us that, I think, was sort of, kicking in causing trouble and showing she was going to do it her way. And that's when things began to go.
Under the polished surface of royal tradition, a deeper controversy began to gather around the births of Meghan Markle's two children, Archie and Lily. In royal life, births are never treated as wholly private events. They unfold before the nation in a ritual the public has long come to expect. The family announces that a child is due, confirms where the baby will be born, shares when the child arrived, and, in time, presents the baby to the public. The names of the godparents are usually known as well. That process is part of the understanding between the monarchy and the people who watch it. Because the royal family stands at the center of national life, these moments are shared rather than hidden. Once that pattern was broken, suspicion began to grow. What made the matter more serious was the kind of voice now attached to it. Hugo Vickers was not treated as a distant critic or a sensational outsider. He had spent 40 years writing about the royal family. He served as captain of the lay stewards at St. George's Chapel. He was among those who carried the Queen's coffin into the chapel. He had been described as one of the most knowledgeable royal biographers in the world, and his new book on Queen Elizabeth II had gone straight into the Sunday Times top 10. It had also been serialized in the Daily Mail. When someone with that kind of standing openly questioned Archie's birth timeline, the issue no longer looked easy to dismiss. For years, Lady Colin Campbell had been asking many of the same questions. She had kept returning to the inconsistencies, pressing them again and again, only to be brushed aside as controversial, unreliable, or extreme. Her critics had found it easy to ignore the question by attacking the messenger. That became far harder once a cautious establishment historian arrived at the same point. The tone changed. The subject moved. What had once been treated as fringe speculation was suddenly standing much closer to the center of accepted public discussion. The matter drew further attention because Hugo Vickers had not set out to make Archie the focus of his appearance. He had come to promote Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal History, a 672-page work published by Hodder in early April. The book was built on decades of personal knowledge of the late Queen. It received a 5-star review from The Telegraph, and its reception carried Vickers onto major programs across Britain. Yet somewhere in that promotional conversation, attention shifted to Meghan, and the question of Archie's birth moved into view. When it did, Vickers described the entire business as crazy. The published timeline, in his view, did not make sense. It appeared to show a woman who had given birth and then later gone into labor on the same day. The obstetrician had never been named. The godparents had never been named. The secrecy around the birth was the point that would not settle. That concern was not entirely new. Similar doubts had already surfaced in an earlier interview about why confidence in the Sussexes had weakened. Those remarks circulated, were picked up, and then seemed to drift without consequence. But once the same concerns returned in front of a camera, spoken calmly and without theatrical language, they landed differently. The presenter himself had covered the original birth announcement while working at The Sun in 2019. He had sent questions to Meghan's communications team at the time, and nothing about the explanation had seemed coherent to him. The time did not make sense. The location did not make sense. The whole episode had carried an oddness that never fully went away. At the center of that oddness stood a simple object outside Buckingham Palace, the easel placed at the forecourt. It was not merely decorative, it served as a formal document of royal birth. A framed notice, signed by the attending physician, was traditionally placed at the palace railings, photographed by the royal press pool, and entered into the institutional archive. That practice existed for a reason. It reached back to the old anxieties of royal succession and to the warming pan scandal of 1688. Over time, the process was formalized, and by 1948, the old requirement of official government attendance had given way to the signature of the surgeon gynecologist. In the modern era, the easel became the visible proof that a royal birth had been publicly and formally recorded. That tradition had been followed clearly in the births of other royal children. For Prince George in July 2013, the easel carried 3 names: Sir Marcus Setchell, Alan Farthing, and Guy Thorpe Beeston. These were identifiable doctors with public credentials and verifiable professional standing. For Princess Charlotte in May 2015, 2 of those names appeared again. For Prince Louis in April 2018, the same names returned once more. They were photographed with Prince William outside the hospital, quoted in press coverage, and absorbed into the public record. In each case, the medical professionals were known in advance, the details were clear, and the institution looked settled and secure. Then came the 6th of May 2019. The easel announcing Archie's birth was placed outside Buckingham Palace. It included the time of birth, 5:26 in the morning British summertime. It gave the weight, 7 pounds and 3 ounces. It named the hospital, the Portland in Westminster. But where the doctor's name should have appeared, there was only a blank space. That blank space became the center of the entire controversy. The Portland hospital issued a brief statement of congratulations and referred to patient confidentiality. Hospitals were under no obligation to speak. That much was obvious. But the problem did not lie in hospital silence alone. Everything the public was told about what happened inside that building that morning came from only 2 people, Harry or Meghan. No named doctor spoke publicly. No named midwife spoke publicly. No member of staff came forward to place themselves in that room. In a sequence of royal birth announcements, 4 easels could be set beside each other, 3 with named doctors, 1 with an empty line. That absence sat beside other missing pieces. The obstetrician was never named. The godparents were never publicly named. Questions about procedure did not fade because the normal markers of clarity never arrived. Instead, secrecy hardened into a feature of the story. It was not simply that something had been kept private. It was that a public institution grounded in continuity and formality had left one of its own official records incomplete. Lady Colin Campbell had been returning to that incompleteness for years. From Castle Goring across long-form discussions and through multiple books, she repeatedly pressed the same point. The issue was not whether people liked her style or trusted her instinct. The issue was the blank line itself. Her book on Meghan and Harry had already raised the matter, and she continued to revisit it. For a long time, that made little difference. The establishment could look away because the question had not yet been voiced by someone it recognized as one of its own. Once Hugo Vickers spoke, that shield weakened. The difference between those 2 figures mattered. Lady Colin Campbell had little institutional position left to protect. Hugo Vickers did. He had access, standing, responsibilities, and long-standing connections. He moved within spaces where caution was not merely personal taste, but a condition of remaining inside the room. That made his words carry a different weight. He still did not go as far as Lady Colin Campbell. He did not use the language she was willing to use. He did not name fraud. He did not speculate wildly about motive. He did not turn accusation into spectacle. Instead, he identified a documentary inconsistency, pointed to the missing names, and left the implication hanging in the air. That restraint made the question harder to dismiss, not easier. Lady Colin Campbell, by contrast, went further. Where Vickers called the timeline crazy business and said the secrecy would not square, she described the matter as a scandal. She placed it beside the great institutional disgraces of royal history. The difference between them was not really one of direction, but of style and institutional freedom. One voice remained measured, careful, and precise. The other was willing to strip away that caution and name the scale of what she believed the issue to be. Yet both arrived at the same essential conclusion. The timeline did not work. The documentary record had a gap, and that gap had never been properly explained. The wider significance of this moment grew stronger because Vickers' book itself was already stirring attention. He had first met the late Queen in 1968 and had gone on to attend her on more than 40 private occasions in his role at St. George's Chapel. In his biography, the section dealing with the Sussexes drew special notice. The book presented the distress caused to the Queen in her final years as something that could not be overstated. One especially striking passage attributed a private remark directly to the Queen, describing Harry as having become a carer for Archie. Because Vickers was known for careful language and historical discipline, that line stood out sharply. It had not been thrown into the record lightly. For 6 years, those who raised the Archie timeline question found themselves pushed into the margins. The pattern never changed. The question would appear, and instead of an answer, the person raising it would come under attack. The mainstream press would not touch it. Royal commentators would avoid it. The matter would be left hanging, unanswered and unexplored, because it was easier to discredit the voice than address the record. What changed now was not the evidence. The evidence had been sitting there from the beginning. What changed was who was now willing to state publicly and on camera that the inconsistencies deserved scrutiny. The documentary picture remained the same. The Buckingham Palace easel for the 6th of May 2019 still showed a blank space where the attending physician's name should have been. The certificate amendment filed at Westminster Register Office on the 5th of June 2019 remained on file. The Sussex spokesperson's statement from January 2021, which attributed that amendment to palace protocol, remained part of the public record. And in the 84 months since Archie's birth, no named doctor, no midwife, and no hospital staff member had publicly come forward as an independent witness to what happened in that room that morning. That was why the level of discussion mattered so much. The issue no longer lived only in online videos or long-form commentary. It had reached a different tier. It now appeared inside a hotter hardback, in a Daily Mail serialization, and in a cleared on-camera interview tied to a major book promotion. Once a question entered that tier, it became much harder for institutions and their chroniclers to behave as though it did not exist. The movement of such stories followed a recognizable path. First came the fringe, where a subject could be mocked, dismissed, or assigned to obsession. Then came the middle zone, where a larger audience heard it, but the mainstream still had enough distance to ignore it. Finally came the point at which someone fully inside the establishment touched it. At that moment, the question no longer came from outside the walls. It came from inside the same room. Lady Colin Campbell had occupied the first stage. The programs that amplified the issue to broader audiences occupied the second. Hugo Vickers, with his institutional standing, prestigious publisher, legal clearance, and wide review coverage, represented the third. That shift affected every editor and royal correspondent who had spent years refusing to engage. Silence was easiest when the subject remained confined to outsiders. It was more difficult once an establishment historian described the timeline in openly doubtful terms. Institutions did not answer every challenge. They responded according to the level of threat. A marginal voice could be ignored without cost. A question raised by a credentialed insider carried a different danger. The longer silence continued after that shift, the more visible and meaningful the silence itself became. Pressure built further because another serious historian, Andrew Laney, was entering the picture with a new paperback edition of his work on the House of York. The fresh material in that edition had been described as sensational. He was not a fringe commentator, not a YouTube personality, but a historian taken seriously by the very publications that had long avoided this subject. That timing created a narrow and tense editorial window. The royal press would have to decide whether to confront a question now living in multiple establishment-level spaces, or continue hoping it would pass before their own editors asked why it had been left untouched. Through all of this, patience emerged as the real method behind the story. The issue had not broken through by way of a single explosive revelation. It had moved slowly, through repetition, persistence, and the quiet endurance of the record itself. The same question had been asked over and over because the same blank line remained. Why was the doctor's line empty? Why was the public record incomplete? Why had no independent witness ever stepped forward? The years passed, the voices changed, but the questions stayed where they had always been. That was what made this moment different. A man known for caution, restraint, and deep establishment ties was not brought in to discuss Archie. He had come to speak about Queen Elizabeth II. The question met him there, in the middle of something else, and he did not avoid it. He allowed the conversation to go to the birth timeline and answered in a way that reflected what he believed the record could bear. That did not look like a planted controversy. It looked like a historian, careful with his language and aware of the stakes, acknowledging what he could no longer comfortably ignore. The issue, then, was no longer simply about personalities, loyalties, or rival camps in the endless Sussex debate. It had narrowed into something more formal and more enduring. The question concerned the record. The record contained a blank space. That blank space had never been filled. One voice from the establishment and one voice long dismissed at its edges had now arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions. Once that happened, the subject could not easily be pushed back to where it had once been.